The Florida Writer Podcast, a discussion about writing and other things. Hello and welcome to this edition of the Florida Writer Podcast. Today I have with me Shannon Winton. Shannon, why don't you give me 60 seconds to make your elevator pitch about who you are and what you do?
Okay, well, I'm Shannon Winton. I'm a developmental editor. I work freelance, and I mostly work with independent authors who work in speculative fiction. So that's fantasy, sci-fi, horror, paranormal romance, urban fantasy, all that wonderful stuff. And my job is basically to take the content of the story and fix whatever errors there are and make that story shine.
All right, so a developmental editor would be someone who fixes the errors. What type of errors are you usually looking for?
So I'm not looking at your grammar. I'm not looking at whether or not you've got a comma in the right place. What I'm looking at is more core to the story. Is your timeline, does it make sense? Do your characters progress through whatever trials and tribulations that they're in a believable, likable manner? Is your world consistent within itself? Are you presenting something that somebody can latch onto emotionally and love that story? So again, what I'm looking at is more the content, what makes up the story itself.
That's really interesting. It's an interesting form of work because it's building the sandcastle rather than building the regular castle.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe that's a bad analogy, but it's just the outline of it.
Yeah, no, I definitely see it more as putting the foundation of the house, because I mean, if you don't have a good story, it doesn't matter how pretty your prose is, or if it looks very professional or polished, people are still not going to be engaged with the content, with what the reader is actually interested in. So it's more of one of the very, very early things. It's the critique of the story. And whether if you've got a good story, you can do all the wonderful polish too. But if you've got a story that it might be missing some aspects at this point, or if you've got an early draft and you're okay, something's missing, but I don't know what it is. If it never gets in there, you're not going to find a fan base.
That's a very good point. Do you think that you have an easier time writing the book blurbs because you have this understanding of content?
I would say, excuse me, I would say it does really help, because it helps you kind of target what people are looking for, what they're interested in, about the book, because you're isolating those core elements that make it something that someone would pick up off the shelf or click on after they've read the blurb on Amazon. So I think it does help a lot, because it really focuses in your energy on what the core of that story is.
Would you recommend that people create their own book blurbs even when they're only, say, halfway through a story, just to have an idea of if it's missing anything?
I think that can help. It sort of depends on the kind of writer you are, but I think it really does, for some people, focus in on what they're trying to write, especially if they are at a point where they're in a crisis spot and they're I don't know if I'm doing the right thing. I don't know if I'm ever going to finish this. Having your concise blurb, knowing exactly what you're trying to write, that's really helpful, I think, for a writer in that position. I know some writers who it's it doesn't matter how long they've been working on something or even how beautiful it is, they're never going to be very good at their own blurbs. And so I don't want to be yeah, everybody should do this, because sometimes that's not for everybody, if that makes sense.
What's the way you keep up with the different genres you work with? If it's mostly speculative fiction, but how do you maintain your thumb on that pulse of what people are really reading?
You read all the time. That's honestly the best answer I can give you. I probably read 3 to 4 books a week. And then if I've got a client in a subgenre that I haven't read in a while, I will go find the top 10 for the previous year or two. And I will start thumbing through those as well, just to see what's actually, being bought, what's actually being read in that genre. If it's one that I've, again, if I haven't seen it in a little while. But that's really the best way to do it. One of the things that I think got me into this was just simply because I've been a voracious reader since I was a little kid. Just being really interested in stories like that, I think, is the core of it. What makes a good story, what engages with me. If it's a genre that I'm not interested in, I won't edit that genre, if that makes sense. So I'm not really into Regency romances. If somebody comes and they have something that looks like just a contemporary romance, I'd probably not be the best editor for them. So I would send them to somebody who's very, very good in that particular genre.
How do you find your clients?
Usually they find me. I do some advertising on social media. I do have a website, but a lot of my clients either come because I've interacted with them in different chat rooms, or if I've interacted with them in different groups to give advice, or if it's because they've gotten word of mouth recommendations from people that I've already worked with.
That's very interesting. So you don't actually do a whole bunch of marketing on your own. You just do organic outreach.
So far, yes. I'm looking into increasing my actual marketing this year and doing a little bit more in the way of educational material, creating educational material and doing vlogs and that kind of stuff. But so far, a lot of my clients have come organically.
Awesome, because we like to hear that just making ourselves available and knowing that we are putting ourselves out there actually works. We've all tried it, and whether we actually have success is varying. But yeah, we have to do that particularly as writers and editors. It's difficult to make yourself stand out from the crowd.
Well, I think one thing that you have to focus on, and I always felt like this was sort of a lame thing when I hear other people saying it, but when you interact with people, you've got to be like your own self. Like, you can't go in and sort of give this, bizarre sales pitch to people, because they're not interested in that. I don't usually interact with people unless whatever it is that they're talking about is something that I'm super interested in as well. So if there's a world building conversation and somebody has some legitimate quest for information, or if they want feedback on some aspect of it, I will jump in that conversation and start helping out where I can. But I wouldn't go and be like, hey, by the way, I'm a developmental editor, and come hang out over at my, on my side of the internet, because I think that's schlocky and it's kind of gross. I do see that, and somehow that works for some people because they keep doing it. I would presume they're actually getting clients, but it seems very weird. And if I was on the other side as a writer and I saw that, it would kind of scare me off.
That's true. It would scare me off as well. Have you ever come across a manuscript that had zero hope?
That's like a really, really difficult thing to say. I've come across manuscripts that are incredibly in need of revising and redrafting. I don't think that I would ever 100% say this is a book that I would not take, except for one instance, and that one had more to do with my personal viewpoints than necessarily anything else, if that makes sense. It was a book that promoted a viewpoint of thinking that went against my morals, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. We all have the right to refuse to read something.
Right. But it was like, if for this book to be successful, I would have to advocate racism. And so it's like, I'm definitely not taking this one, and I think it should be put in the trash. And so that was the only instance that I can think of where, well, that kind of situation is the only situation where I would absolutely refuse to help try to make that book better.
Do you have a an editing process that you use?
Usually I do. I will read a manuscript, generally speaking, at least 3 times. I promise to, but I'll usually read through at least 3 times before I make any complete decisions. The first time that I read through a manuscript, I'm reading it for my own pleasure. What do I like about this story? What's actually popping out at me? What's working for it? And then when I go back through, I do more of a didactic breakdown. Okay, does this make sense? Is there a logical consistency in all the different elements? Like, if I see the main character in the first scene, is he still the same person? Can I actually see him going through this journey and becoming who he became? Is that consistent with who we started off with? If I have a world in which a particular mode of transportation will get you from point A to point B in X amount of time, did they actually skip around and manage to make it, to wherever their destination was too fast for that particular thing? That's a big deal with fantasy books. If you're traveling on foot and you've got to get 3/4 of the way, across the country, and it should take you 5 weeks, but you get there in 2 days, that's kind of a problem. And if it's something that I see, if I'm going through it, I'm looking for logical inaccuracies or inconsistencies. The first time around, then it would be a lot harder to critique the enjoyment of the story. But if I look for it the second time, or if it was such I don't want to say a glaring issue, but if it was something that was very, very overt in the first one, I'll go ahead and pencil that in. Simply because if I noticed it that quickly, the standard reader is going to see it too. Because, you've got different kinds of readers. You've got people who are reading it for pleasure. You'll have people who are reading something for core engagement with the characters. And then you have people who just love to read and they're voracious and they will read anything. And it's kind of weird to me because I won't read everything. But anyway, if I'm seeing it without even trying to see it, other people will see that problem too. But generally speaking, if I'm looking for that kind of thing, or if I'm looking for, during the second read, I'll look for what didn't work, where the gaps are. And then if I'm unsure how to take something, and if the author isn't sure, because I will communicate with them, if they're not sure which direction they're trying to go, I'll usually read it a third time to try to figure out what the best options are for fixing any problems that I see. A lot of times I kind of know what sort of story the author is trying to write because we'll communicate, we'll engage, we'll talk, or I'll email them if I'm not sure what they're doing in a particular scene. And sometimes the answer to a problem can be vastly different depending on what they're doing. So if I've got a story that has romantic elements and they're telling me they're writing some sort of paranormal romance, and their goal is to have the audience really engage with the romantic aspects, but then it turns out to be a tragedy, well, we need to fix the tragedy. But if they're not sure where they're going and it's working really well as a tragedy and they don't have, say, a built-in audience, if they don't have, a platform that they built on the romance, we might be able to highlight that tragedy more. So depending on what the author wants, that solution could be vastly different on how they revise, if that makes sense.
I find it really fascinating. To me, the developmental portion of writing is one of the fun parts. And then I have a feeling many people think that as well. And then once you get down to the nitty gritty of the other portions of editing, then everyone gets a little more whiny, maybe is the right word.
I think there's definitely different levels of restrictiveness depending on what kind of editing you're doing, for sure. And this being so near the beginning when you have, I don't want to say less differentiation, but where the author hasn't been working on something necessarily for a year, for 2 years, if their brain is still fresh, if they're still engaged with it, then it's really fun because there's so much like innovation and you can see the sparks fly. It's just really enjoyable to see the changes through the manuscript throughout the process. Whereas, as you said, with the nitty gritty, no, you must have your comma here. Oh, we're gonna fight about the Oxford comma versus not having Oxford comma. Yeah, that doesn't really engage me either. That's not a lot of fun.
I'm an Oxford girl. I that much I'm going to say out loud. When clients come to you, are they usually fresh or like having only been working on something for a year? Or is it that you find people who have been toiling on something for 5-7 years?
I actually, since I work with independent authors more than any other category, I get a lot of people who are interested in self-publishing. They've usually been working on something either for a very short time because they're trying to do a bunch of books all at once, or they've been working on it for 2 or 3 years. It's kind of weird because I don't normally see books that are actually in that 1-year mark. I don't think I've worked with anybody who has been working on a book for more than 10 years or anything like that. I think the people who have that one book in them, they don't normally come for developmental editing because they've got the passion where they know exactly what they want this to look like, and they may not be interested in getting feedback that is contrary to their vision.
When you mentioned that a lot of people will come to you and they're working on several books, are they working on a series?
Yeah, if you're doing kind of quick publishing, or if you're doing a quick turnaround in order to basically keep your Amazon subscribers engaged with you, you tend to publish a bunch of books in a very short period of time, or you'll publish once every couple of months. And so you're trying to get a very quick turnaround between when you're writing your story versus when you're publishing your story. And so when I've got somebody who's trying to either write to market or do rapid publishing, the situation for their developmental feedback is a little bit different than I would for somebody who is creating something either more literary or who is more engaged with sharpening their story so they can release like one every couple of years.
Well, what's your favorite portion of doing this? Is when you get to give it back to the person and you see how you can help it, how they've been helped, or is it more like just getting your hands dirty and starting the process?
Oh man, so I actually hate the part where I hand back my feedback because it can be very emotionally stressful. The author wants to hear that everything is perfect, everything is great, everybody will love this story. At the same time, they're handing it to you to have you critique it because they want to know exactly what isn't working. How do I fix it? Did I do what I thought I did? Because we all, we'll all write and we will think we've communicated something and it'll turn out that we have not. Everybody goes through that. And so you've got to lay out honestly, but in a manner that helps them exactly what's wrong. And that can be very stressful for the author, for sure. But it's also stressful for me because I know it's hard to receive. So whenever I click that send with all my feedback, I usually have that sort of butterfly in my stomach moment where I'm like, oh God. But as far as what I love is I love seeing either the finished product and the success they've had, or if I'm getting this for multiple rounds of developmental editing, like how much the book has improved from the feedback. I mean, it's their baby, but I help them bring it into this world. So that's always thrilling.
You're the obstetrician of books.
There you go.
All right, well, I'm going to ask one last question. What is your best advice for offering feedback?
I really, really want to focus on what the author is looking to do, especially if you're reading something that may not be your cup of tea. I'm in a lot of critique groups. I've given critique. And one of the things that I noticed that is very hard for authors to do is receive feedback from somebody who's not actually interested in what the author wants the book to be, but interested in what they as a reader want the book to be. And so if you are giving feedback and you may not want the end result to be that the protagonist dies at the end, and all of your feedback is that you should save the protagonist and ways to save the protagonist, that's not really helpful for an author. If you know what they're doing, even if it's not necessarily what you would do, help them make the best story that aligns with their vision.
That is really good advice. All right, now we get to this end of our podcast show where we have our rapid fire questions.
Oh no.
I'm going to ask you 3 random questions that don't have anything to do with writing, and you can feel free to answer any way you want. All right, how about the last movie you saw?
Whoa, goodness. I don't watch very many movies. The last movie that I saw was actually, I think it's called Johnny Stecchino. I have a friend who rented out a theater and we watched it in Italian.
Sunrise or sunset?
Sunset.
And what time did you go to bed last night?
1 a.m.
1 a.m. My goodness.
I'm a night owl.
You work better at night, or do you just hang out at night?
Oh, I work better at night.
The house quiet?
The house is quiet. I got my great ambiance with the dark light and then the lamps around me. The dog is usually sleeping at my feet. It's just nice and cozy. It's great for getting into books.
Well, Shannon Winton, this has been a lot of fun. How can people get in touch with you?
You can find me at shannonwinton.com. That's pretty easy. I'm also on Facebook. I've just lost my train of thought. My apologies. I have a business page on Facebook that you can come find me. Just search Shannon Winton. And if you wanted to contact me directly, you can reach me through the Messenger app there, or you can send an email through submissions@shannonwinton.com.
Shannon, thank you very much.
Thank you.
This ends this edition of the Florida Writer Podcast. Allison out. Shannon Winton is a developmental editor of speculative fiction such as sci-fi, urban fantasy, and alternative history. She can be found on Facebook at Shannon Winton Nurse Novel, at The Nurse Novel. For more information on the Florida Writers Association, please visit us on the web at floridawriters.net.